Chatter, for your extremely generous and fulsome introduction to me there. I don't know whether I'm entirely worthy of that, but I very much appreciate your words and your sentiments. I'm going to endeavor to share my screen with you now. Let's see if I can master this. And I hope that you will be able to see. Let's have a look.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I've described this about the dangers of the us and them mentality. I found myself in recent months reflecting very deeply on what causes discord, both in families and in communities. And then if we extrapolate that further into the wider world, having been responsible for being a contributor to the Brexit book, one couldn't help but discover this very deep fissure of us and them, of leavers and remainers. There became this sort of tribal chasm of animosity between people who'd taken different views. We've seen this in the United States over the polarization of the political arena between Republicans and Democrats. And it can be a very corrosive aspect to society. And I've been trying to think about what causes this. Why is it that we have so much animosity in the form of us and them? We find this in institutions, in faculties, in, as I say, families and in communities and in organizations right across the globe. And it dissipates our energies, it corrodes our trust, and it erodes our capacity to engage and move forward. And it's something I think we all need to give thought to. So how do we understand peaceful coexistence? Surely we should all be aspiring to a coexistence, the ability to live alongside one another. So if at the very basics, we tolerate one another, it doesn't necessarily mean we need to admire and become great friends and buddies, but let's at least learn to live with one another as human beings, but also live alongside nature and the natural world, something which clearly is not happening well at the moment. We have an us and them between mankind and the natural world. So we've got the whole issue of companies. What is the problem there? How do we ensure peaceful coexistence in companies? How do we ensure it in organizations and institutions? This is particularly true of academic institutions who are riven with rivalries and divisions, which really go against the spirit of what education institutions should be about. Our own homes and families, sadly, are bedeviled with rifts, rivalries, and jealousies, which mean that people don't get on and at least tolerate one another. Communities are divided and they're dissipated, and nations themselves are riven. And so we need to start to say, what brings about peaceful coexistence? How do we learn to understand, to tolerate, to rub along and get along with people, even if we don't subscribe to their beliefs, their convictions, their outlooks? How on earth can we get to a situation where we at least tolerate one another and get along reasonably peacefully? Because if we don't solve that, we're having serious problems which affect all our lives and cause mental illness, both in individuals, but you could almost say mental instability within nations and the international community. I chose this photograph, which I took myself, by the way. I love this idea of a very busy central London location It's Trafalgar Square, by the way, and there was a mallard duck, a male duck, you know, quite at ease in one of the fountains in one of the busiest cities in the world. And for me, it gave me reason for cheer in this time. Now, there are different types of existence and coexistence. There's static coexistence and there's progressive coexistence. And ladies and gentlemen, what we should be aspiring to is progressive coexistence. When I think of static coexistence, I often find myself reflecting on the early days of the Cold War between the East and the West after 1945, where a situation arose where rival ideologies were at odds with one another. They were not in a state of out and out military conflict, but they were in a state of precisely that, Cold War as opposed to hot war. And static coexistence, in a way, is a form of Cold War. And what do we see it manifests itself as? Polarized attitudes, where people are at odds with one another. We get mutual distrust because this us and them mentality emerges. It causes people to be riven with distrust. Suspicion. Why are they doing that? Why are they going on that? What are they about to do next? People become preoccupied, almost paranoid about what is going on with the other party that may or may not exist. An unwillingness to reach out and cooperate. In other words, we have gone into a sort of silo mentality, and that's very dangerous for any institution, any organization, any nation for that matter, to retreat into a cultural redoubt. And of course, dogmatism is the prevailing outlook. People become extremely dogmatic. They hold dear to their dogma, and this causes them to become myopic and blinkered. Institutions can become myopic and blinkered. Families can become myopic and blinkered. So can entire nations become myopic and blinkered and go into a sort of siege mentality. History tells us of many instances where certain cultures and communities have cut themselves off and are in a state of static coexistence with their neighbors and the wider communities. So we need to look out for examples of static coexistence. There are many of them. They are corrosive because they dissipate our creative energies. We are so preoccupied with the them, what they are doing, or what they may be doing, or what they may be planning, that we stop being creative and innovative ourselves. And it causes us to have this, or almost, as I say, a paranoia, a fear, a mistrust, a suspicion, which is very dangerous for any relationships and communities and the wider world. So we've got the flip side of this, which is progressive coexistence, where, for instance, an organization, they may be our rivals, they may be our competitors, they may be nations that we have traditionally had problems with for whatever reason, and yet we can actually make changes from the static to the progressive. So what are the changes that we can make? And as I say, these start within a family context, they can be within a communal context, a corporate context, they can be within the public realm and within society at large and at state and international level. Firstly, we need to foster an appreciation of that things are done differently, that we don't have a monopoly of truth. None of us, no individual, no person, no community, no society, no nation has a monopoly of truth and wisdom. In other words, there's always another way of looking at things. There's always another way in which to approach. And we need to instill that through education, through our paternal and maternal guidance, and our outlook within our own organizations. We need to say to our fellow work colleagues or institutional colleagues, by the way, there are other ways of doing it. We may not be doing it the right way, or there could be several right ways. We need to instill that outlook. Pragmatism is essential if we're going to have progressive coexistence, that ability to adapt and live within the world in which we live, with all its imperfections, but striving to actually try and accommodate situations and move forward with a spirit of mutual understanding, of actually saying, look, I understand you don't entirely agree with me, I don't entirely agree with you. Where is common ground? Is there any overlap? Are there areas where we can potentially collaborate, or at least get along in a conducive way? I've used the word tentative there, tentative approaches to collaboration. Even countries which may have enormous ideological differences can reach out. I can remember very vividly from my university days, I was very active politically when I was at university, and also in debating societies. And we invited at that time, and it was a very political time, very agitated time, the early 80s, the Cold War was still going on, but we invited the Russian ambassador to the university to come and give a speech. And when he gave that speech, we presented some gramophone records, and I can still remember the words that he said. And that is, he said, do you know, for all the differences between East and West, music transcends boundaries. So one of the ways in can be through cultural links. We can forge links. We can find common areas of ground. Even if there are many fields on which we disagree, we can reach out, yes, tentatively, very gingerly, at sometimes lower levels, but we can reach out to see maybe there's some areas where we could engage in knowledge sharing. And surprisingly, we suddenly discover that they're more like us than we thought, and we're more like them than we thought. That common thread of humanity. By so doing, what do? We reduce fear. We reduce fear because we start to understand that there is common ground, even if there are areas of mistrust and suspicion that still exist, or of commercial rivalry. And as I say, we discover areas of common interest. We all have a common interest in the planet, in planet Earth, in our health well-being. It is marvelous to see major corporate rivals in the pharmaceutical world actually coming together. Most of the time they're hiding away their research, they're keeping it secret, they're terrified of industrial espionage. And yet because of COVID, what have they done? They've communicated, they've reached out, they've engaged as never before. And this is going to have long-term benefits, not just for our health, but also for the development of progressive coexistence. And I would actually cite that as an example of progressive coexistence, as opposed to the normal static coexistence, which often exists in the pharmaceutical sector. We often need to think about what causes animus. Animus, we think of animosity. And I'm going to cite an example. I don't know if you know of these two gentlemen, Mohammed Al-Fayed, a very famous Egyptian-born millionaire, and Tiny Rowland, who's no longer with us, he's dead now, but was also a very powerful industrialist and millionaire. Now, these two gentlemen had a very famous 8-year rift, and they had a famous rivalry about trying to get control and ownership of London, a very famous London department store called Harrods. And they developed an enormous rivalry. that burgeoned into a hatred. So much so that there were legal writs, there were legal cases, there were all sorts of examples of these two men being utterly obsessed with their own rivalry. And it meant that both of them took their eye off the commercial ball because they were so obsessed with each other's rivalry, their desire to overtake the other one or to defeat the other one in business, that they became irrational. They overpaid certain things. They were prepared to throw money at lawyers to try and get a little victory over the other one. And this rivalry lasted for 8 years. And it cost many, many thousands of pounds, possibly millions of pounds, almost certainly, all because two men became jealous of one another, became commercial rivals, and it caused a cancer at the heart of their businesses until eventually, after 8 years of animosity and tension and a sort of hot war, I suppose, between these two men, until it was finally resolved with a little bit of theatre in the food hall of the Harrods department store. They actually finally met and shook hands and let bygones be bygones. And sometimes, again, we have to learn to back down. We have to learn to, put the past behind us and reach out and say, look, we're never going to be friends, but I respect you as a businessman, or I respect you as a colleague. Let's find a way forward. It's a very interesting case study, those two men, worth looking into if you're not familiar with them. My belief is, and this quotation is from me, ladies and gentlemen, that we've got a problem with this situation of static coexistence, because what it does, it causes time, energy, and precious resources are expended in preparing for conflict, or in some cases, actively engineering conflict, in situations. Just imagine if a similar determination was applied to moving from static coexistence to progressive coexistence. We're so often fixated with the negatives, with our competitors, with our rivals, with the people within our departments we don't get on, or department heads that we're bidding against, or whatever that may be, that all our energy is going into that static coexistence and possible conflict. And we're not expending energy on the progressive side. We need to tip the balance, ladies and gentlemen, and invest in the progressive side of things. We'd all do well to reflect on the role of ego. The two gentlemen I've just been talking about, ego was a major factor in the animus there. With all our lives, a lot of the static conflict and the hot conflict is due to pride, ego, and it gets in the way of our ability to compromise, to engage, to listen, and to fall and to reach out to people. So we need to think about what needs to be done to change the prevailing dynamic. How do we, in our families, in our institutions, our organizations, bring about a change? Can we see examples of static coexistence? How do we actually convert that into progressive coexistence? Equally, how can nations reach out to countries that maybe they've not had cordial relations with? I can remember a couple of years ago, the British government reaching out to Cuba, not a country with which Britain has a close historical or ideological relationship with, but you've got to learn to get along. And as a result of this, certain major cultural institutions in the UK went over to Cuba, ballet organizations, sporting organizations, and relationships went from being static to mildly progressive. I wouldn't say enormously progressive, but there was certainly a noticeable warming and improvements. We often find ourselves wondering what others are up to. And this is what causes a lot of the problems. There's internal competition. Some organizations are setting different departments against each other, and you get this idea of payment by results. You get the old imperial adage, divide and rule. I've seen many institutions and organizations where divide and rule is used by the leadership and management. Cultures become poisoned because of this static coexistence. As a result, there's outlook is blinkered. And as I've mentioned earlier, you get paranoia. And it's almost as if everyone is reading Niccolo Machiavelli's Il Principe, The Prince, which is, you know, it's all about the survival of the fittest, in effect. The ends justify the means. Well, they don't, ladies and gentlemen. This is one book you do not want to make as your manual for life. So finally, does it have to be a dog-eat-dog world? Do we know and explore our own weaknesses as individuals, as family members, as communal members, and in the organizations that we work or lead? How do we take ourselves out of our own silo mentality? How do we engage with other cultures, other institutions, other countries, some of which we know nothing about? Why are some people fearful of change? Major factor, ladies and gentlemen. Might existing processes actually entrench attitudes? If so, we've got to look at those and address them. Collaboration does not mean capitulation. I think this is one of the most powerful messages that we can actually send out as regard to progressive coexistence. The ability to work with others, to compromise, to share, does not mean that you are giving up territory. Cooperation helps foster fresh thinking because it causes the exchange of ideas, it causes interaction. How might necessity help change attitudes? COVID has certainly had a role in that, and we're finding this through a virtual conference. We would all do well to venture outside our comfort zones. And that includes companies, it includes corporations, it includes governments and nations. And certainly the Brexit process means many corporations are going to have to find fresh markets and engage in ways they wouldn't have done formerly when they had the low-hanging fruit to garner. So there's a challenge to all of us. I would ask you to think where in your life, world, community, and organizations and nations can you see examples of static coexistence? What can we do to move to peaceful coexistence, progressive coexistence? Thank you for your attention.